Aaron, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah. So yeah, like I said, my name is Aaron. Live in the greater Boston area. Background-wise, I'm educated as a physicist. Got my PhD from the Ohio State University nearly a decade ago now. Um, Currently work in data science while also research affiliate at MIT here in Boston. Uh, and I've spent also a fair bit of time doing things related to history of science, biblical studies. Just last month, I came back from giving a presentation at the Society of Biblical Literature. So I try to keep my toes in various different waters. As the saying goes, jack of all trades, master of none.
Cool. So the topic today is, did the Bethlehem Star really exist? Could you tell us about, like, what is the story behind the Bethlehem Star? What are the phenomenon that it was supposed to have done? And is that physically possible with known phenomenon? Could it have been a real star?
Absolutely, yeah. So our main source and basically only source for this story, other than everyone else repeating it after on, is from the first book of the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew. Hop into chapter 2, and we are told this story that during the days of King Herod the Great, wise men from the east, or in the Greek, the term is magi, magoi, they've come from the east saying, hey, we have seen this star, we've seen his star rising, and we are seeing this as a sign of the birth of the King of the Jews. We've come to worship him. Where's he at? Of course, Herod is the king at the time and being told, hey, there's a new king in town. That's not me. This is no bueno. So basically interrogates them on information, interrogates the scholars, the scribes and priests of Judea about where is this child supposed to be born. They're told Bethlehem. The wise men are then instructed to go find the child and then report back to Herod. And as you can imagine, when Herod is doing that, he's twirling his mustache the whole time as evilly as possible. Lo and behold, the Magi set out, and lo and behold, the star that they had seen before is now going before them. It arrives at the location, stops over the place where the child was, fills them with great joy. They go into the house Jesus and family are in, see the mother, and give gifts. And then in a dream, they're told, hey, get out of Dodge. That king you talked to earlier ain't so good. That's the very basic story, and pretty much all the details we have about the star is subsumed in just 12 verses of the Gospel of Matthew. There are many later accounts of the story that are basing off Matthew and the non-canonical stories of Jesus' birth, usually getting more and more elaborate. One of my favorite ones is called the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. It's definitely pseudo because not only is it trying to pretend like it's another version of the Gospel of Matthew, but it has all sorts of additions, such as when the Holy Family are running off to Egypt, they come across a bunch of dragons, and baby Jesus is able to tame the dragons, as you do.
That was a better story. Should have kept that one.
It's in some medieval art, but it is definitely not part of the traditional nativity play. At least not the recent ones I've seen. So that's the basic story. And then from that point, many people have wondered what this star might actually have been. For the longest time, it's just seen as this is clearly a sign sent from God. It's a supernatural entity. Maybe it's an angel in stellar form. But starting in the modern period, especially in the 17th or 18th century, there were attempts to say the various miracle stories of the Bible were misunderstood naturalistic events. And the Star of Bethlehem was one of those things. And since basically the late 18th century, there have been many, many attempts to try to explain what the star might have been. Almost every year, you'll hear someone else saying they've published some new result about what it could have been. And this has literally been going on for 200 years or so, with little progress on the astronomy front, and most Bible scholars basically ignoring the question since basically the 1830s.
Yeah. So what exactly is the physical phenomenon that is required of the star? That it appears one day, and then over the course of maybe a few weeks, traverses to a specific location and stops?
Yeah. So some of the details are not going to be clear, especially like how long the star lasted. It's going to depend on, well, where do these wise men, these magi, come from? How long is their trip? Is the star shining for the whole point? Some have also interpreted that the reason the Magi had to go and ask where the King of the Jews was born was because their star they were following disappeared, or were they even following a star in the first place? Were they only following the star from the trip to Jerusalem to Bethlehem, which is the only part that's clearly in Matthew's gospel? In later versions, the star is traveling the whole time with them, is giving them food along the way. In some versions of the story, Jesus literally is the star, is both star and baby at the exact same time. It gets obviously more and more elaborate as the generations had gone on. But the main requirements is, the star appeared someday. The term that's used in the original Greek suggests that it's the rising of the star that got their attention. The phrase that you'll see usually in like the King James version is they saw the star in the east. More modern translations will say at the rising. It gets a little bit ambiguous because where do stars rise? Well, in the east. So that linguistic ambiguity is right there in the original Greek. So it takes a little bit of finessing to figure out what was the precise meaning. Either way, star rises. This is supposed to somehow be indicative of a new king being born. And if that star is supposed to be shining the whole time it took the wise men to get there, maybe it's on the order of weeks or months to do the trip. It depends on how quickly they packed, how fast their camels were, or if they had some extremely different way of traveling that we just don't know about. Either way, it lasts for some period of time, and the most important part of the story, the one that we get the details on, is the trip from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. At that point, it says the star went before them, went before the wise men, until it arrives. So it reaches some destination, and then it stops, and then it stops specifically over where the young child was. Where's the young child? In the next verse, it tells us he's in a house. So it's somehow stopping and hovering over a particular hovel within the town of Bethlehem. And the grammar structure it also uses suggests that the star isn't like high up in the sky, actually. When Matthew uses the same structure elsewhere, it's something that's like right on top of or just hovering right above. So, for example, at the empty tomb scene, when an angel comes and opens up the door to the tomb, the angel then sits upon that door, uses the exact same grammar structure. So in the sense the star is basically sitting right above the house. You'll see that in some older movie depictions as well. But obviously, stars can't hover right against houses. If an actual star did that, the Earth would have been turned into plasma. It would have been very noticeable.
For sure. So that would definitely eliminate it from being a real star unless there's some new quantum physics we haven't discovered yet.
Yeah.
So the most plausible explanation would be is probably not a star. Would it need to actually be a star for the text to be correct? Could it be like a meteorite of some kind and still count as a star because it serves the same function?
Yeah, so the word star in Greek, aster, it can be broader depending on context. It could refer to a planet, it could refer to a meteorite, it could refer to a comet. So mostly it's based on contextual details. So often, like when they refer to the various planets, they'll basically say the god name and they'll say like the god name star. So this is the Zeus star for what we call now Jupiter, as an example. So the word can have a wider valence, and it's just basically in context. Does that wider meaning still exist there? So can meteors, at least though, try to fit some of the details? Well, in particular, in the story with the star going before the wise men. So the wise men are going from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, and that's pretty much a southerly course. So could a meteor flash above them and head in that southerly direction? Sure. But a meteor does a very poor job of leading the wise men the whole way, because the trip on foot from Jerusalem to Bethlehem is about a 2-hour walk. Meteors, are basically, gone in a flash. At most, some remnant could still be like floating around the sky after they burst for maybe a minute. At the very least, it's not going to last through that whole trip. And it definitely won't like stand over a location. It zips over. It's very bad at also like locating where to go. I remember in particular, I was looking at some literature of a meteor flash that was seen back in the 1960s. And there were reports of seeing that flash everywhere from Michigan to Pennsylvania, and everyone thinking it was like dropped somewhere in their backyard. But that's over like a 1,000-mile distance. So if you're using a meteor to reach your destination, you probably picked one of the worst GPSs you could.
Well, I don't see that as a problem. I see that as a feature of the story because it's simply interpretation. So they could have just interpreted it to have guided them, and so it's totally fine.
Mm-hmm.
What about like an asteroid? So a very, very large asteroid in space, large enough to reflect the light off it, so people can see it from Earth.
Yeah,
Traveling.
that has rarely been suggested. It has the problem that when an asteroid is, orbiting or the sun, just like all the other planets and asteroids, it doesn't have that much noticeable movement in a couple hours' time. If you were able to track it over days, you might be able to notice its relative motion across the stars. But the time it would take to walk from Bethlehem or from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, that would not have been a noticeable amount. And we have no observations of asteroids in antiquity. The earliest observations we actually have of asteroids is in the age of the telescope. So it would be not just unusual, it would be unprecedented, and it still wouldn't fit the description well because an asteroid observation still wouldn't fit those motions very well.
Well, it couldn't be very, very big and moving very, very fast. Like maybe a moon-sized asteroid of some kind or something very, very large, moving faster than what we'd expect through space could potentially do that. And it would be not only possible, but likely given the size of the universe, that would happen somewhere.
The orbital mechanics just really doesn't allow that if it's going to have like any sort of stable orbit. If it's coming in fast enough to be noticeable to human eyes in that short a period of time, it's going to be significantly close, and we're going to have uh, perhaps a close encounter in the worst way possible. On the other hand, maybe it is some very different kind of vessel, and it has also been suggested it was a UFO, was an alien air spacecraft of some sort. The best evidence I can think of is the 1977 made-for-TV film on Jesus, which starts off with the birth story, and one of the wise men is played by James Earl Jones, the voice of Darth Vader. So therefore, the Star of Bethlehem was the Death Star.
Yes, that would be perfect. Yes.
Yeah, I haven't gotten that thesis published yet.
Darth Vader just put on a mask, like a not burnt mask, teleported down, and decided to walk in a wise man's outfit for like 2 weeks. So,
Exactly.
what is your favorite hypothesis? What do you think is the best explanation?
Well, astronomical or in general?
Astronomical first, so it's specifically related
Okay.
to astronomical phenomenon, and then in general.
Yeah. I kind of go back and forth of what would be better insofar as what we have records for. So we can like reconstruct where all the planets were with extremely good accuracy for any given night in the last, several thousand years. So can I tell you that Jupiter and Saturn were very close to each other and in configuration called a conjunction in 7 BC? Yes, we can do the computations. We can be absolutely or at least so reasonably sure we can call it absolute, that that was what someone could have seen on a clear night sky. So those are things we can confirm. Or on the other hand, we do have records from China that there was a comet in 5 BCE, which would also conform well with the alleged time of Jesus' birth. He's supposed to be born towards the end of the reign of Herod the Great. Herod dies in either late 5, early 4 BCE. So the timing of that comet would work very well. And we know it existed in non-Christian records, so we can be pretty darn sure that this isn't just something that was invented by some scribe in the first century or something like that. On the other hand, when it comes to the interpretation of those things, it becomes messy. When it comes to what would a comet mean to ancient people, 9 times out of 10, they tell us what it means. And it is basically the sign of doom, of death and decay. It isn't like a good sign that says, oh, a new baby is born. It's more like, oh no, my baby's going to die. Or, oh no, the king is going to die. No, almost no one ever looks at a comet and says, yippee. That is very, very rare. So, and if it's a rare thing, it's not a very good interpretation. Conversely, when it comes to conjunctions or other astrological alignments, basically, when we test astrologers on how they interpret the what's in the zodiac, what's on a star chart, basically they will give you answers that not only don't conform well to reality, but actually they have an agreement level with each other that's almost no better than chance. So what does a star chart actually mean? What do you want it to mean? I'm sure I could find a way to give it to you. I've actually even done that with alleged star charts for Jesus and say, look, here are all these configurations that, like, according to the astrological textbooks, are really good signs of configurations. And I say, yes, you're right. But on the other hand, if we look at these other parts, it says Jesus should have been basically a prostitute suffering from elephantiasis and of no regard. I literally can get the exact same things out of the same star charts with the same books. So that makes everything extremely difficult. And again, none of these things really conform to what is described. What is really described in that story is a miraculous star, and that's how it was interpreted basically by everyone up until basically, like I say, the 18th century, when they basically said, "Oh no, it's miraculous. We can't have that." Uh, at that point, basically everyone was like, "Hey, the laws of Isaac Newton seem to govern the universe. Hey, the universe seems to work like clockwork. Where do miracles fit in? Oh, oh boy. Okay, what if we just misunderstood all these old miracle stories?" And this was the way to try to get around that. And when I say all the miracle stories, I mean all of them. Most famously, I'll have to give the most famous one. This comes from a German theologian in the early 1820s, 1830s, a guy by the name of Heinrich Paulus. And he's basically kind of like the high point of this movement of trying to explain all the things. And most famously, he tries explaining the story of Jesus walking on water. So the real story is, it was a dark and stormy night. The disciples were off on a boat in the Sea of Galilee, and they were being tossed about. They can't see anything because of the fog and the wind and the storm, and they have no idea where they are. And they've actually gotten so lost, they didn't even realize they actually had been beached. So they are stuck on the beach shore. Then once the storm is calming, Jesus is walking to them along the beach shore, and the disciples still think they're on the middle of the water. So when they see Jesus walking to them, they're like, "Oh, our master, he's walking on water." It was just a total misunderstanding. Rinse and repeat this sort of strategy for every single story about Jesus in the Bible, including the resurrection. Uh, the Star of Bethlehem was just part of that same strategy, and the vast majority of Bible scholars have looked at that and said, "This ain't it, Chief. No, we got to do something else." The reality is, what is described is miraculous, and if we apply historical criticism to this, even besides that as a miracle story, we have many reasons to doubt the story, even if it weren't so thoroughly miraculous.
Oh yeah, the fact that he was born in the time of Herod during the census of a different king who existed 10 years prior makes it a
Yeah.
difficult time warp thing going on there. But what is your best explanation? Do you think that it's just made up, most likely?
Oh, yeah. I definitely think that is the best explanation, and the leading one that you'll find in biblical studies is that this was based on the story, or I shouldn't say the story, but a prophecy from the Old Testament, specifically from Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. This is known as the Star Prophecy. We know it was an extremely popular prophecy used by Jews and Christians later at this time, because we see it's directly cited in the Dead Sea Scrolls for the coming of a Messiah. It's even used more explicitly in the 130s during the revolt of Simon Bar Kokhba. His name even means he actually changed his name to Bar Kokhba to become Simon, son of the star, to even better fit the prophecy of being the star as alleged in that prophecy. And he tried leading this massive revolt against Rome, and he was declared to be the Messiah until, well, his revolt, like all the other ones against Rome, went, well, very, very badly. So we definitely know this prophecy was used a lot. Later, Christian commenters also say, "Oh, this is clearly supposed to be in fulfillment of this prophecy." It's very likely that the author of the Gospel of Matthew has this in mind when he's creating his narrative. So this is usually seen as a major source. But on the other hand, one detail that doesn't explain well is the fact there's nothing in the star prophecy that talks about a moving star. So I look a little bit more broad from that, and there are examples of moving guiding stars in non-Jewish literature. And probably the best example is actually in the story of Aeneas. Are you familiar with the myths of Aeneas?
Not really, no.
All right. Aeneas was one of the Trojans during the Trojan War and the huge battle between the Trojans and the Achaeans. As the story, of course, also goes, the Trojans are eventually defeated through guile on the part of Odysseus in particular, and Aeneas and some of the last Trojans escape the destruction of the city, and they are basically in crying out for help, and ultimately they will be guided to their new home, which is Rome. So the Romans are actually Trojans, and they'll eventually get their revenge against the Greeks once they take over the Greek lands later. But nonetheless, Aeneas, when he and his family and the last Trojans are in desperate need of help, one of the things that actually helps guide them to their new place is a star is zipping across the sky, and it becomes their guide on the way ultimately to Italy. So this guiding star, which we know was an extremely popular trope, it's actually even used in the poetry of Virgil when he writes a story called the Aeneid, based on the story of Aeneas, but also it's just straight up pro-Augustus propaganda. It's basically to say, like, and all this is to prophesy Julius Caesar and his son Augustus and why they're so great and wonderful and why they should be ruling. It was completely destined, 1,000 years earlier from this point.
So when was
this,
Numbers written? You said that this was
oh,
taken from Numbers. Was
yeah,
Numbers written after the Julius Caesar prophecy, and so it was probably taken from there, or was it written before?
I think the vast majority of Old Testament scholars will tell you it's significantly older because so Numbers is one of the books of the Pentateuch. Most Bible scholars will probably tell you the Pentateuch was assembled during the Babylonian exile, maybe later. The absolute latest it could be is 2nd century BC. That's like the absolute latest that it could be, because then we actually find like versions of that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Julius Caesar is killed in 44 BCE. The Aeneid is written a few decades after that. So the Star Prophecy is definitely older than the Roman myth.
Gotcha.
Or at least the version of the Roman myth that Virgil writes.
Gotcha. And is this a common trope throughout history in that time period, or do you think it originated in the Hebrew text?
What is there seems to be particular to this writer because first off, the original prophecy in its context seems to actually be looking forward not to like the Messiah who will bring about the apocalypse, but it's actually looking more forward to the King David. And the fuller statement in the prophecy, and this is coming from a Gentile prophet who's being forced to say this by God, saying, I see him not now, but he's coming. A star will rise out of Jacob and a scepter will rise out of Israel. And then they will go and crush the head of Edom and Moab. So basically a story of eventually the future David coming along and showing his martial prowess and basically subduing rebellious regions to bring them all under control in the unified monarchy, or at least as the story of David and Solomon is supposed to go. That seems to be what's in view by the original author of that prophecy. When that was actually written, like I say, we know at least the Pentateuch was assembled at the absolute latest in the 2nd century BC. Most Bible scholars will say it was assembled centuries earlier, but then various parts are older still. How old that particular prophecy is, I don't know if there's any consensus on when that portion was written. I would have to talk to someone much more knowledgeable about Hebrew studies.
So I know that like the story of Noah's Ark was likely copied from Hammurabi, I forget what that's called. Was there anything similar about the stars or other prophecies in the Hammurabi's tales that could be linked to the stars?
Probably the closest I can think of is this association of stars with kings or stars with gods. That is relatively common, especially after their death. So the most famous examples of people becoming stars after their death would be like Julius Caesar. Again, that was a very clear example, but obviously a bit late. In older Sumerian, Babylonian tablets,
Oddly, that's sort of true, isn't it? Because the particles of Julius Caesar could have spread through the atmosphere and gotten absorbed into the sun. That one's technically possible, right?
maybe, but they were being much more particular that so I'll give the background story for that. So Julius Caesar, he's killed on the Ides of March, and a few weeks after that, there are these funeral games that are being held to honor him. And early on in the funeral games, they see this new star rising up in the sky. It actually happens to be a comet, and we've actually been able to reconstruct the path of this comet because it was also recorded in China. So we can use the observations and some computer software to map out the most likely orbit that it had. So we are pretty darn sure that what they saw was a comet, and they said that comet was Caesar's soul being taken up to heaven, specifically being lifted up to heaven by Venus, the goddess Venus, not the planet Venus. This is obviously propaganda for Julius Caesar, because other people just called it a comet and said this was bad news. Other people said, no, it's his soul. It's actually just a regular star. You don't have to be afraid of it. So very mixed views, and it was basically if you were pro-Caesar or anti-Caesar was how you interpret it. In the same way Democrats and Republicans today will interpret any piece of news. Oh, the economy ticked up. Oh, that means there's fewer jobs. You always find someone who can find the silver lining and the dark cloud.
It's like the thing that the less there's a correlation between the lower the number of pirates, the worse the global warming. Therefore, we should have more
Ah,
pirates.
oh yeah, oh that's true. You can't possibly get that by coincidence.
Exactly. All pirates
Yeah,
are
yeah.
necessary.
Yeah, yeah. So, like I said, that was a clear example of politically saying a new star was a person's soul rising to heaven. Plato actually has this idea as well. He talks about this in the Timaeus and elsewhere that people are originally from the heavens, and their soul, if it's good, will actually be able to return to the star that it came from. The idea of astral immortality you can find in Sumerian, Babylonian literature. It seems to also be in the Old Testament. The clearest example of it in the Old Testament is in the book of Daniel. In chapter 12, it says that all the righteous will become like stars in heaven. And some Bible scholars also argue the promise to Abraham that your children, your seed, will be like the stars in the heavens. Many interpret that as also saying your children will become the stars, that they'll also become immortals in heaven. So this idea does seem to be ancient and widespread in the ancient Near East and the greater ancient Mediterranean.
So, are there any successful predictions or accountings of stars or astrology or in any religion or any different kinds of texts from the past actually make scientifically accurate predictions about astronomy?
Hmm. About astronomy specifically, from astrologers, not so much. The closest I can think of where an astrologer was claiming that they could prove um, astrology, that it could actually like predict personalities. There was a study back in the 1970s, and I think it was called the Mars effect. And a scholar or astrology researcher arguing that he could actually show there was a statistically significant correlation between the location of Mars and the birth of athletes or other really successful people. Ultimately, the research suggested that it was a result not of astrology, but of selection bias in the data sets. But I don't know the details well enough about there. On the other hand, there have been like a dozen different studies recently, including one that was in Nature back in the 1980s, to actually, show astrology doesn't work. Now, of course, when I say astrology doesn't work, this has been basically uh, known to astronomers since really the 18th century, maybe even earlier. Like even like Isaac Newton by that time seemed to have already kind of dismissed it. He gave it like almost no thought at that point. Um, Not everyone necessarily on the board. Like Galileo was big time an astrologer. He thought it actually like explained a lot about his own life and his own personality. But even by the end of the century Galileo was in, astrology was basically on the out and out with scientific people, and it has been mostly pseudoscience since then. Nonetheless, there's been a lot of studies to try to see if anyone can show anything about it. And over and over and over again, it shows either null results or even worse than null results. I had mentioned the study of the astrologers not only failing to actually predict what a star chart means and having it connect to reality, but when they actually compare each other and say like they give an astrologer 20 star charts and 20 personality reports. They say put them together and which ones you think go together. And then they had like several other astrologers do the same thing. So not only did the astrologers fail to match the personality reports with the star charts better than chance, they didn't agree with each other almost any better than chance. So it's almost impossible for astrology to show itself it's true because it can't even show itself to be internally consistent in coming up with its predictions. So if astrology is ever right, it's because if you throw enough darts, you'll eventually hit the board.
Yeah, so like that reminds me of the best example I can think of is from Hinduism. In the Vedas, it predicts that the age of the earth is the sleeping and waking cycle of Brahman, which is 4.3 billion years. That's approximately close to the age of the earth. So that's really close to the age of the earth.
Mm.
And so that one is, I think, the closest example of something of a religion being right about astronomy 6,000 years before we knew anything about astronomy. Now, of course, I think if you read the text, it says we're only at half of that because we're like halfway through a waking cycle. So it's
Mm.
technically wrong, but the number is really close 95%
Yeah.
accuracy. I like it.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is we can actually also like look at the history of that number because the stuff about a Brahma here is actually based on a combination of Old Babylonian, Greco-Roman, and then later Persian influence of astrology that had gone to India in the Common Era. So like a lot of the cycles that Brahma year is based on is combinations of the idea of the world year that you find in Plato, the idea of these near 1,000-year cycles based on conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn, and basically just like if you put a whole bunch of these cycles on top of each other and multiply them together, yeah, you get these fantastically large numbers that can occasionally look like it fits in the neighborhood of other numbers that we can scientifically verify. But basically, the way that the Brahma number was created wasn't from like great deep scientific research. It was here are all these important numbers in astrology. Let's pack them all together.
Well, do you think that would be necessarily a problem? So if it got a bunch of them right and none of them wrong, the method that they came to it, I think, would be less. It'd be nice if it was like a very methodologically repeatable method that we could use to make future predictions. But even if it was just like shaking a magic 8 ball and they got enough of them right, I still think that would be evidence for their religious belief. Because if they get sufficiently enough predictions correct about the universe and not very many wrong, I think that's good evidence to believe whatever they're saying to some degree.
I can see your point with that. So yeah, it would probably also depend on many of the other things, because it's not like that's the only prediction that Hindu astrologers make. And if you're wondering, no, the Hindu astrologers aren't making better predictions than the Western astrologers. And when the skeptics point that out, they usually get run out of town.
Yeah, or beheaded, depending on your time frame. When you're
I'm actually been talking like more recent history. There was a I forget his name, but he was a really popular, well-known skeptic in India. And he the most famous thing was him going on Indian national TV and basically calling some magician a fraud because that person was saying that he can like do all sorts of things with magic. It's like, oh, I have this death spell that I can kill you instantly. It's like, all right, show, do it. And they literally like had the entire performance on TV for hours of this shaman person trying to basically do the death spell to kill this person. And the skeptic was just laughing the whole time because nothing happened to him. But eventually he also then like busted down this alleged weeping statue of, I forget if it was of Jesus or of Mary. I think it was a statue of Mary. It allegedly seemed to be leaking water from, and he eventually went and figured out what it was actually was toilet water from upstairs leaking down the wall through capillary action. And this apparently upset enough people that it ultimately caused him to have to literally flee the country for his own life. And he's basically been a refugee since then.
Yeah. It's still illegal to be an atheism in many countries like Malaysia. I was invited there for a few debates, and it's a little questionable to do that.
Yeah, I think specifically in India, I don't think it's illegal to be an atheist necessarily, but I think it's technically illegal to disparage religion. I forget the exact details, but it was the sort of trumped up charge that made it so that skeptic had to really run for his life.
Yeah. Are there any other claims that you've studied, like Muhammad cutting the moon in half? Like is that possible?
He would have to have a very, very long stick to be able to do that. Maybe he could have borrowed the one from China. So one of the Chinese stories is Journey to the West. And there, the character Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, has a staff called Jingubang, who he can change to any size he wants, and he can use it to tear down mountains. So maybe Muhammad was able to borrow Jingubang, make it huge, and take down the moon. Maybe that's what's going on.
Yeah, it has to be a lightsaber too to just pass through it, leave no marks.
Yeah, but unfortunately, if you do that, then you everyone will just say, Muhammad, dude, that's no moon.
So what else have you been researching recently? Any other kinds of mystical claims about astronomy that you have had an interest in?
Yeah, so I've allowed this to like intersect with other things of anything else that looks stellar in the Bible. And the thing I've probably been giving the most focus on, and was part of the recent presentation I did at Society of Biblical Literature, was this title that Jesus has, that it comes up twice in the book of Revelation and once in 2 Peter, where Jesus is called the morning star. And quite literally, I look at the biblical or the biblical studies literature, and no one really has an explanation for where this title comes from. And I would think I was able to go in and convince the people listening that I have a functional theory that can explain where this idea actually comes from, what technique they were using for interpreting the Old Testament and smashing verses together to get where that comes from. So this is Jesus literally as a star, specifically the morning star, which is usually a designation for seeing the planet Venus in the morning. And of course, it's a little bit strange. Well, why would anyone be calling Jesus a planet? I don't think it's ultimately related to astrology. This is related to a different sort of Jewish technique of exegesis called Pesher. That's been one. Also, just in general, that I've used this to look at the intersection of science and religion more broadly. So, as the stories seem to be going, is every time science learns something, religion has to somehow adapt to adopt this new information. And what are the techniques religious people use, and are they actually epistemically justified, or are these basically just ways of minimizing cognitive dissonance? Some of the strategies, they seem reasonable and they have a long pedigree within theology, but what are the other consequences? And are those consequences so dire that religious people should probably say, maybe we shouldn't be doing that. Here's all the other consequences of believing that. And also, are there inconsistencies of where people use this? The best example I can think of is where people will use an approach called accommodationism, where God will express himself in a way that can be understood by the original ancient audience, but may not, conform perfectly to modern science. So when people are reading the book of Genesis and the creation story, you need to understand this was to be understood by an audience that's, reading things like the creation story about Marduk. Or they're reading the Epic of Gilgamesh. They're not people who understand quantum physics. So if you show them a wave function, they're going to say, yeah, we don't know anything what you just said. Could you make this simpler? Okay, simpler. Okay, I don't understand what rocks are made of. So could you make this really, really simple? That's a basic idea. But well, people then try to do that for Genesis to then say, and this is why we don't have to, believe that the earth is only 6,000 years old and all those things. Conversely, they'll look at the story about the end of the world coming and the apocalypse, and they'll say, no, we need to actually treat that literally, that even though the physics indicates that the universe isn't going to allow for a new heaven, a new earth as like described in Revelation, but no, instead, the universe is just going to eternally expand and go cold, and eventually atoms will move at no amount at all, and effectively time will stop because nothing will be happening anymore. That's the actual universe we see. And then the same scientists who say read Genesis metaphorically, but the future read literally, and even deny the science that indicates that. And I'm just like, wow, this is wonderfully inconsistent. Why aren't you guys just young earth creationists then? You've allowed us to deny the future. Why can't we use the same technique to deny the past? To be consistent, you realize this technique doesn't work, and that's something I've been exploring and wanting to write on.
Yeah, that's definitely a big one. The George Lemaitre predicting the Big Bang and trying to explain it into the creation of Genesis and the 7-day creation, and saying, how could it possibly work? Well, there weren't any days back then. There were no sun, no earth, so days could mean anything essentially. What days was God going off of? Are these God days?
Tuesdays.
And how Tuesdays? Yes. Tuesdays.
Yeah.
And so that's an interesting one. Do you think that the Big Bang prediction actually counts as evidence in some way towards Christianity, because it does predict a beginning, and there was in fact a beginning? Or do you think that the beginning described in physics doesn't describe a beginning to all nature? It's just a beginning of the current relative nature that we can see around us, kind of a thing. And so it doesn't actually confirm the creation story.
Yeah. To me, that actually has two prongs to it. So one, what is the original creation account for Christians and Jews? And is it like the ex nihilo creation? And apparently, from what I understand, the scholarship actually indicates the idea of creation ex nihilo, that there wasn't pre-existing stuff before God started to create, is actually something that was only a philosophical or theological invention in the 2nd century AD to deal with other quote unquote heretics of that time among the Christians. That basically, if you read Genesis in its original form, its most likely grammatical form, and how it was interpreted for the longest time, it was really believed that when God began to create, he used pre-existing material to create the world, in the same way the other myths of the Babylonians and the Egyptians and elsewhere, that there was always something there, and that it was from that earlier something they created new things. Creation ex nihilo was a later invention to try to get around other alleged heretical problems. So when people say, we've been saying creation ex nihilo all the time, I would say only when you have gone back and forced these old myths to conform to that. And then, of course, we jump to the 20th and 21st century. We now know that our observable universe had an earliest point of time. The question then is, was there time earlier than that? And there is lots of there's a lot of theory that is grounded in our current understanding of quantum mechanics and general relativity, but also the realization that those first moments have giant question marks to it. So could it be that the earliest moments that we can reconstruct from projecting the universe back, is that the earliest moments possible? Maybe, but on the other hand, there are extremely valid models that would also suggest that the universe is also in some way time infinite in both the forward and backward direction. That the Big Bang point, or that earliest point in the universe, is special in the timeline, but it is not the earliest moment. In particular, Sean Carroll and one of his grad students, Chen, I forget her first name, they had created a model that basically the universe is running in time in both directions from the Big Bang. So in that sense, that the universe is eternal and time is running in both directions, and there isn't even a special direction to time that way. It's an interesting model, but it's not something we can prove at this point. Other models would suggest that, yeah, the universe tunneled through nothingness to create. Ultimately, we have all these huge question marks because we currently don't have a reconciliation between quantum mechanics and general relativity that we can apply. No one has yet successfully created a quantum theory of gravity. And with that, we don't know how to basically figure out what we should predict at those earliest moments. So I'm agnostic. If I was to ask, like, deep down philosophically, what seems more intuitive to me, it's that there always was something. A first moment of time always kind of drives my mind up the wall, much more than just time going on infinitely. But this is just intuition. And what I've also learned from intuition versus physics is physics wins. Intuition has been wrong way too much, way too often, to use that to suggest one physics is better than the other.
So what is your response to like the William Lane Craig, there can't be an infinite past because of the Grim Reaper paradox kind of a thing?
Yeah. I'm trying to remember. It was Kuntz, I think, who came up with the Grim Reaper paradox.
Or was it Pruss?
Or it might have been Pruss. Yeah, Kuntz and Pruss. They're the ones who've been doing the most advanced versions of some sort of cosmological argument. In many ways, what Craig does now is old hat by comparison.
He's just quoting the other guys. He's taking the others' work and doing it the easy way.
Yeah, right. Because I mean, in many ways, Craig is still trying to be old hat and saying actual infinities are metaphysically or logically impossible, even. And well, with my math background, when he says, well, there can't be an actual infinite metaphysically because look at all these absurdities it creates, and I'm just like, no, you're just doing the math wrong. What you're saying is mathematically impossible is what I call simple homework for an undergrad.
Basic set theory. You can do addition with infinites. It's a basic thing. You just using it in the general sense, infinity and then another infinity without specifying different sizes or cardinalities of the infinities doesn't work just because it's too general.
Right,
like
exactly.
Saying, if you add x and y, what do you get?
Well, I will note, though, that actually in infinite set theory, we don't actually have well defined how to do subtraction. So that actually gets a little bit touchier. But addition you can do, and comparing set sizes, that is very well understood in Cantorian infinite set theory. Okay, but yeah, the Grim Reaper paradox, I forget the details so well, but when I remember reading things like that, it reminds me of where have other paradoxes been. So, for example, any kind of reimagining of the original Zeno's paradox. The best example of, like, in a modern form is, imagine you have a steel ball that it's bouncing up and down every time it hits the surface, and that surface is also metal, and when they touch, it completes an electric circuit. So when the ball hits the metal pan, the light switches on, and when the metal ball is off, it's off, and every time it hits, it bounces half as high. So as it bounces, the bounce gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So the question is, when it's going back and forth and light turn on and off, on and off, on and off, on and off, when the ball has completed an infinite number of these hits, will the light switch be on or off? And the answer is ambiguous. It actually depends on the starting conditions. And I think a lot of the infinity paradoxes is just that they're not well defined enough. And if you add in additional constraints, you go from we can't even make sense of this as to now it's no longer ambiguous. In the same sort of way, if we say if I subtract x from y, is it a positive value or a negative value? I don't know. You didn't tell me what the numbers were. It's like, oh, it's ambiguous. So maybe it's incoherent. It's like, no, we just need more information so we can actually figure out what the answer ought to be. So that's not exactly like a great disproof of what Proust and Kuhns have done. Just that I think a lot of the problem is basically in the formulation versus there being an underlying problem with infinity itself.
Yeah, I think the Grim Reaper paradox is that there's a Grim Reaper that's going to kill Bob at noon or whatever, and there's going to be one that kills him in half that time, and then half that, et cetera, ad infinitum. So there's there's no individual Grim Reaper that actually kills him, but he still dies at noon or something. Therefore, it's a contradiction.
Yeah.
So what do you think about the claim that there's the tensed theory of time version where the present moment couldn't have possibly began or came to the present moment if there was an infinite amount of past moments, because if there was an infinite amount of past moments, we never could have reached the present moment?
Yeah. I would say that the problem with that idea is the idea of traveling through time to this moment when if you're taking the B theory of time, the non-tense version of time, then all those moments exist eternally in that sense. And so there being an infinite amount of time isn't nearly as incoherent. I mean, it's the same sort of idea of having an infinite number line. The entire number line exists. You don't have to explain, well, how did you get to zero if the negative numbers go infinitely far back? It's just, no, the whole set exists at once. If you take a tense list theory of time, I think that entire problem disappears. And the tense list theory of time, the block universe version, is the one that seems most consistent with special and general relativity. So I would say the physics indicates this version of time is the more likely, and it seems to avoid that particular conundrum.
The one I like is usually that there is a present moment selector. So like if we have a movie, we can select which scene to start from. So even if there's infinitely many scenes before, it doesn't matter. We're going to pick 47 because we want to see this scene essentially.
Yeah.
And there could potentially be something in physics that could be a present moment selector that could generate any arbitrary starting point, and that would solve the problem as well.
Yeah, and of course, anytime there's a selector, then we have to wonder how that selection was ultimately done, and if it has a reason, what is that reason? If there is no reason, it's random. In which case, is that really selecting?
Yeah. Oh, what is your position on that? Because I was reading the recent poll on physicists' fundamental attitudes towards quantum mechanics, something along those lines, and it says randomness is a irreducible fundamental force in physics, or is it just apparent? Or those? What is your position on randomness? Is it a fundamental thing in physics, irreducible?
So I think that question is probably answered, at least partially, by what's the best interpretation of quantum mechanics if you're taking the Copenhagen interpretations versus the many worlds interpretation or the Everettian interpretation. I feel more convinced and actually think it's more simple to go with the many worlds interpretation, in part because wave collapse theories like in the Copenhagen interpretations, it basically says take the Schrodinger equation and then add this. The many worlds interpretation is take the Schrodinger equation and that's all you need. You don't need that additional stuff. And the Schrodinger equation basically says all the possibilities exist together at once, and they're basically in a superposition with each other, and they only quote unquote split off when there's a new interaction coming in, what we would call an observation. And in that case, all the possible states exist, and that would then suggest that there isn't so much randomness. It's just that each possible state exists. And if you were to count up the possibilities, it would look like, the various distributions you get in statistics for what looks like a normal distribution or a Poisson distribution, etc. That would be my best take, but I imagine there's a lot of details about randomness even within the Everettian interpretation, which I don't feel like I can address well.
Yeah. So you don't. There's no intuition that, well, there's infinitely many worlds of every possible variety doesn't cause an intuitional just cringe for you. Like, I hate this. It's terrible. It's ugly.
Well, Well, in some ways, I don't cringe because that infinite number of worlds is also in the Copenhagen interpretations. It just says all those worlds except one all disappear at the observation. They're just all thrown away because they're all there. They're all there in the Schrodinger equation. The Everettian interpreter just says we don't just arbitrarily throw them all away except for the one that we happen to observe. They all do exist in some form, one way or another.
What is your
And to
view?
me, yeah. Oh, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. Oh, well, I was going to
Uh,
ask about emergent space-time. So,
ah.
one of the models is that space and time are emergent from quantum processes in some way. What do you think about that?
I think that might be the most fruitful way of achieving quantum gravity. In some ways, because what general relativity explains well is like, these larger structures, but ultimately if things are like, being built at these quantum levels, then it seems like if you have a complicated enough quantum system, then the network of those things could then maybe develop what we then would call space-time. It's not obvious, of course, how to get from point A to point B in creating that. It is well outside my pay grade. But if I, were given a ton of money to go back and say, all right, this is what you're going to study from now on. And what approach am I going to take to try to reconcile quantum mechanics and general relativity? That would probably be the place I would focus. And if someone beats me to it and shows a completely different way, I'd say, well, darn. At least I had this pile of money to spend while I was doing, hopefully, at least some interesting research. But nonetheless, I don't know if it is the best explanation. It's just where I would focus my research time if I had it.
How do you understand that? Because my interpretation is that a field requires space, and so to have a quantum field or something, how can it generate space-time if it always requires a spatial field to have a field at all?
Yeah. So, well, when we use a field and we're using it in a spatial context, we're saying every point in space has some sort of value. You could even just, talk about field values more generally, even not in space. And you're just saying our system has all these various states. The state of the value of the electric field, the state of the gravitational field, things like that. Just all these, collections of magnitudes that you can put together. And if you have a collection of magnitudes, you can also then have them pointing in certain ways. And by pointing, it's basically in a more conceptual space rather than physical space. We can even talk about spaces in completely abstract, non-space-time ways. So, for example, like most of my work is in data science. That's for my day job. And if you deal with things like in natural language processing, in fact, in particular, if those of you who have seen this, Chat GTP is like this now amazingly good chatbot if you've played around with it at all. But ultimately, the way that's built is that all this information about the text is basically embedded into a really big matrix, ultimately. Like that's a big chunk of it. And in that matrix, you can basically travel around in it and look at things in conceptual space. So you can like orient your axis there and see like how all the words related to bigness are in one place, all the words for smallness are somewhere else, and you can actually have direction in like this big small conceptual space and see how words travel along it between like huge versus tiny or medium size, and just see how they travel along in that sort of literal conceptual space. So yeah, when I hear the word space being used in that for fields and that, it can have a much broader meaning than our space-time. It's just then the question, can these fields have the sort of interactions that produce what we would consider movement and change in our space-time? It's definitely conceptually mind-boggling, and maybe the best way to put it is to use a phrase from the TV set behind me, wibbly wobbly timey wimey.
So what is your view on virtual particles and the Casimir effect? What is a virtual particle? How does it
Yeah,
exist?
I do not know enough to answer that well, but it seems that it can be explained completely as a mathematical object and not necessarily physical, because you can also get the same effect using lattice theory, like another mathematical approach for explaining it. And lattice theory is often used in quantum chromodynamics for talking about the interactions between other subatomic particles, especially within the nucleus. And so this can then also describe forces between there, and there isn't the creation of these virtual particles. So if you can explain the same sort of thing with a different mathematical approach, and you get the same results if they give you identical things, it kind of undercuts the idea that a physical entity is necessary for that. But I don't know the details well enough to debate that with confidence.
Another question I've been having having a debate with another person via email was about absolute zero. If a particle could reach absolute zero, would it still exist?
So first, just assuming it's a classical particle, so we don't worry about quantum effects. If it's at absolute zero, then it and all the other neighboring particles have no relative motion to each other, and that's ultimately then to say it has no temperature. One of the things, though, is we actually know that's not achievable, even if ignoring quantum mechanic effects. That it's actually the third law of not third law, the third law of thermodynamics. That basically it takes an infinite number of steps to actually achieve that. That basically, you can make things get colder and colder through the process of if you basically use a heat pump, you can do all these steps and get closer and closer and closer, but the number of steps it actually would take to reach absolute zero is infinite. And since you can't do an infinite number of piston movements in a finite period of time, you'll never achieve absolute zero. And this is, again, even ignoring issues of quantum mechanics or inefficiencies in the engine and all that. So it's not an achievable situation, but we could get absurdly close. We've gotten particles down to like a billionth of a Kelvin. It's absurdly cold. We can do that. But getting all the way to zero is, best we can understand, actually impossible. Add on top of that quantum mechanics that talks about the uncertainty of position and momentum of particles, then to say that a particle has absolutely no momentum, it has no movement, would then basically say it has every location possible. And maybe that's where the argument is going, that if a particle were at absolute zero, it wouldn't exist because it would be everywhere at once. I don't know if that's what the argument was.
Yeah, it's essentially that for an object to exist, it needs some power to exist, and if it loses all power, it ceases to exist. And so if you drain all of the energy from it, all of the heat or something along those lines, then it would essentially dissolve to nothingness.
That definitely doesn't follow from absolute zero stuff. There's nothing physically impossible for a particle to just sit there and have no energy. There's nothing in the laws of physics that says that's impossible. Maybe it's impossible to mechanically reach such a point, but the particle just sitting there, at least in classical mechanics, that's not disallowed. The idea that it loses almost like a vital force or something like that that's maintaining it, that sounds more like old Aristotelian or Aquinas-like metaphysics. And, well, as far as I'm concerned, the Middle Ages are over, and that entire metaphysical approach is at best forced into modern physics rather than something that is well defined and derived from the actual facts.
Gotcha. Well, we have been going for about an hour. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Yeah. So my main website is draaronadair.com. There it also has links to my various social media, so you can find me Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn if you want to give me a new six-figure salary. No, I'm actually happy at my current job. I probably won't take a new job at this point. It has to be at least seven figures. Okay.
In yen? I can do yen.
Maybe in old Zimbabwe dollars, you could pay me in seven figures. Yeah. Let's see here. I do have a YouTube, but it's extremely rarely used. But if you type my name into YouTube, I've done a whole bunch of interviews with other podcasters. I'm also currently coming out with a book soon with my co-author, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. It's a book about aliens and religion. So first off, do aliens exist? I argue probably yes, and I try to give what reasons we can, even though I don't think we can show they've come and visited us yet to prove that they exist. But probably yes. And what are the theological implications for the existence of aliens, and especially what does that do to most Christian theology? And we find that, there are lots and lots of problems for the particulars to Christian theology. It makes the problem of evil much worse. On the other hand, if you're Mormon, you're probably going to be doing okay. It won't be as big of a bum out because the Mormons have been pro-alien since the beginning.
Quick question on that one though. What is your position? I forget what the problem is called where we don't see any anything in life.
Ah,
Why don't we see it? But it seems
the
like
Fermi
if
paradox.
yes, the Fermi paradox. Why don't we see any radio waves if there is any intelligent life? Because we would expect that they would probably follow a similar technological vein, and we'd get like how ours was sent out by Hitler before we got to space flight. We'd probably see something similar from other life forms. Why don't we see
Yeah.
that? Why don't we see any radio waves from any other life forms?
Yeah, there's dozens of reasons that can be given for solutions to the Fermi paradox. Everything from the aliens are hiding for either good or nefarious reasons. Um, they've all died out. They just kill themselves real quickly. Maybe the easy solution is that that intelligent life is relatively rare. So the nearest civilization that might exist in our galaxy is so tremendously far away that even if we are transmitting radio signals for thousands of years, they couldn't pick up our signals and vice versa. I mean, just to put into perspective, if you wanted to travel from one end of one end of our galaxy to the other, it's over 100,000 light years. So even at light speed to an outside observer, it would take over 100,000 years to traverse. So if we're on one side of the galaxy and our possible neighbors are on the opposite, it would take literally a geological age to pick up a radio signal. And also, after all that space, the radio signals are attenuating. The signal gets weaker and weaker as space goes out. So even if they were signaling, it could be the case that their signal is so attenuated that we can't make it out from the background. I remember one SETI astronomer had done the calculation to show that if you took something like the old Arecibo radio telescope and had it transmit out with enough energy that another Arecibo telescope on the other side of the galaxy could pick it up, the telescope would melt. There would just be so much energy flowing through it. It would just, turn to slag. It is very hard to just send out a broadcast like that. So that is probably maybe the simplest reason why it's actually harder to do than we might first allege. And also, if the aliens want to communicate with us, they actually have to actively do it. And well, again, if it takes so much energy to make a transmitter that does that, and you don't have a good deal on Spotify, you're probably not going to be able to, do that sort of podcast and just beg and hope somebody actually listened.
Gotcha. All right. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you very much. And